Good morning, everyone. This is Attorney Nathaniel Lee. This show is actually sponsored by my law firm, Lee Carlson Crowley LLP. Today, we have my outstanding historic guest, Attorney Milton of LA. He famously represented Rodney King. That's an important case in American history because that introduced videotaping of police misconduct, which is a legacy that stays with us on a daily basis. Also, Attorney Vanita, Masters in Tax, crack research analyst, cyber security expert. So we have a superstar panel today. And today, though, we had these historic election in the midterm. And we're gonna have start off with Attorney Banks because we just had better than expected results in the midterm, but I'm not happy, particularly locally, with our turnout. We have 470-some thousand Democratic voters in Marion County, and only 130 voted, 130,000. That was pretty dismal, but the great news, of course, is our famous prosecutor won easily, but I don't like the voter turnout. But Attorney Banks, what's your thoughts on this midterm election results?
First, thank you, Attorney Lee, for having me. And I want to thank all of our listeners that voted in the midterm elections on November 8th. Many of our freedoms, as you know, were on the ballot. And thanks to you voters, we were able to secure women's reproductive rights in states across the country, block a number of election deniers from gaining seats in the U.S. Congress, in state legislatures across the country, and in Secretary of State election official roles. And you were able to ban slavery as a form of punishment in 4 states. You proved the pundits, the pollsters, and the media wrong. And in fact, democracy was on the ballot. And while Americans were concerned about inflation and crime, they were also concerned about reproductive freedoms, voting rights, climate change, and social justice. We did not see the predicted red wave. We saw a dramatic increase in the youth vote. And one of the biggest takeaways from my perspective is that Americans rejected extremism and MAGA Republicans and election denialism. And that this election was not a wholesale rejection of the Republican Party or the endorsement of the Democratic Party. Some Republicans won. We saw that Florida and Texas and other parts of the country are deeply red, and the country is still deeply divided. We were talking before the show, Milton, that we saw the first African-American female elected as the mayor of Los Angeles, Karen Bass, after a long and expensive campaign. And I was wondering about your thoughts, Milton, with respect to that election and other important elections in California.
Well, Ms. Vanita Banks, thanks for that excellent overview of what happened in our country this past week, and the reiteration of the fact that that tsunami of red did not happen as was predicted and expected. And it kind of, for me, gave a refreshing breath of Trump's surge that I thought was coming again, even though he has now decided to come in the ring and show these boys how to fight this battle. It's not over, y'all. It is definitely not over to save this country. But as to Ms. Bash, I have a lot of hope for her. I think she has the right policies in mind to do something for Los Angeles. I was a little afraid, as I mentioned to you when I came in this morning, of her connection with Scientology, because that organization, I won't say it scares me, but it concerns me of how they handle their affairs and how they handle people. It seems like an official, ordained, anointed religious mafia, the way they conduct themselves. So I still don't like that association, whatever degree it is, with them by her. But I have a lot of confidence in her. So that's briefly what I have to say about things.
Well, from my perspective, for the first time, I think in American history, we have African-American now in the chief executive officers of the 5 largest cities in America come January 1st, from New York to Chicago to LA to Houston and above. It's a historic election from that standpoint, because we've not seen that before, but they have a lot of challenges ahead. Namely, is that we had an upsurge in criminal activities, particularly violent crime and homicide. And after the pandemic, we saw the eradication of any gun control laws. We had one passed, a limited one passed by the House, but here in our state, for example, our Republican-controlled legislator, they decided to pass a law to allow everybody to carry a gun openly now without getting a license. So now we have a situation in our state where anybody could get a gun unless you got a felony conviction and not on parole or probation or something. It's just a terrible, terrible episode, because they don't manufacture a gun in the Black community, but somehow we get the worst of those, and there's just too many guns. And I hope that these mayors can tackle that. Now, as it relates to Florida, the Democrats got drugged down in Florida, and Florida appears to be a red state, but what really happened in Florida, because I worked on one of the campaigns down there, is that the Republican had a massive, massive amount of money. Ron DeSantis had $105 million to start the campaign in September, and we had a highly contested governor's race that ended in September. So while the Democrats were attacking each other, Republicans were doing something that led to their phenomenal ground game. They end up investing money, and for the first time in Florida history, the Republican out-registered Democrats like 3-1 in the 2 years leading up to the election. So for the first time in Florida history, they have now more registered Republican than Democrats. So even though the Republican would win Florida, Florida had a plurality of a couple 100,000 more registered Democrats than Republican, but the Democrats didn't vote. Well, in this election, for the first time, the Republican actually outnumbered the Democrat only because the Republicans spent about $50 million, so I heard, in terms of voter registration to get their voters out. Now, Florida got close to, 22 million people. And so the Republicans invest heavily. They started with the Hispanic community, I should say not Hispanic, but the Cuban community down in Miami. And they did a phenomenal job down there to the detriment of the Democrat. Meanwhile, the Democrat, they went from the state chairman, I think the state chairman was a lady named Jackie Lee, no relationship to Nathaniel Lee, of course. And then they went to a Cuban state chair. And I never talked to him, but they did a dismal job, I thought, in the state of Florida. And the net result, with the contested governor's race, they spent their money attacking each other, and it was just a comedy of mistakes. I thought Nikki Fried, who was the Secretary of Agriculture, should have dropped out earlier, but she has a right to run. But that resulted in the inability of Charlie Crist to raise enough money to properly run the race that we needed in Florida. And that's why it appears such a one-sided result in Florida. And so one other thing too I might point out about Florida, Ron DeSantis, of course, has been featured as a leading candidate on the Republican side for president, right? And his legacy has to do with this anti-woke. And it's a little bit insulting to me that somehow the American people has taken on this anti-woke because we're ignorant as to what it means. The woke movement had nothing to do with liberal causes. The woke had to do with slavery and things like that. That is that you got to be awake for these Klans people. You have to be awake for the adverse police officers. So be aware. And so the wokeness had to do with protection of the rights of Black folks initially. Now they've transformed woke into being something bad. It just galls me when I hear him saying woke legislation. And I'm thinking, we have no historical perspective of these things. And that was very frustrating to me.
Attorney Lee, that characterization, as you stated, of relative to wokeness is infuriating to me as well. And I'm glad that our frequent caller, Pierre, has raised the issue of the Stop Woke Act, which of course has been touted by Governor DeSantis. And this Stop Woke Act was blocked through a preliminary injunction this week in a 138-page order from Chief U.S. District Judge Mark Waller. He granted this injunction and blocking state officials from enforcing what he called a positively dystopian policy, restricting how lessons on race and gender can be taught in colleges and universities. And the Florida legislature had approved the anti-woke, quote unquote, legislation. And this was House Bill 7, or the Individual Freedom Act, earlier this year. This legislation would prohibit schools and companies and colleges and universities from teaching about our history and from leveling any guilt or blame to students and employees based on race and sex. They were taking aim at lessons over issues like white privilege and protecting and creating new protections for students and workers, including a provision that a person should not be, quote, instructed to feel guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress due to their race, sex, color, or national origin. Judge Walker determined that this legislation violated First Amendment free speech protections, along with due process rights in the 14th Amendment on college campuses, and that you cannot ban professors from expressing viewpoints in their classrooms. And so there will certainly be an appeal of the court's order and more to follow.
Yeah, and so for our listeners, our call-in number is 833-653-3529, 833-653-3529. One of the things that Attorney Binks said I thought was important, also Grimes, is that in the midterms, when the Democrats lost the House, I thought the biggest problem was the state of New York. New York had a really bad outcome. A state that's 2-1 Democrat, the governor won by 5 points or so. And they had a lot of political infighting, as you guys recall, with the former governor who resigned from office. And that was a bizarre cancellation event. He had all these inappropriate touching allegation. They tried to file criminal charges. He resigned, and then poof, nothing happened. It was sort of like the the lieutenant governor in Virginia, same thing. You know, he had a lot of adverse publicity. He was on the news every day. And then he leaves office and then it disappears. And we're seeing something bizarre also in the Georgia race. One of the things I'm concerned about is that Reverend Warnock apparently is in a post-divorce issue, and his wife's attorney is basically doing everything possible to cast him in a bad light. It's just unthinkable in terms of how that could play out in national politics, you know, so I was concerned about that. But in any event.
Well, in terms of former Governor Cuomo, he disappeared for a minute, but he is also making a comeback. He has a podcast that has recently been launched, and I have some thoughts on the upcoming Georgia Senate runoff election after we hear from our caller, Attorney Lee.
You say,
okay,
you said Cuomo has a podcast, Banks?
Yes.
Okay.
And then, of course, his brother is back on a news station as well.
Right.
Okay, caller, you have a question coming for us. You're on mute, caller. Hello, caller? Okay, you're off mute now. What's your question or comment, sir?
Hello, Brother Nate.
How you doing today, sir?
All right, doing good. And I want to say hello to Attorney Graham, Attorney Banks. Very good synopsis. I thought that Walker, I read that ruling, Walker. I thought that was scathing. But what was so crazy about it is that he hit them with, you guys are hollering about, you are championing free speech and First Amendment, at the same time curtailing it. And what was critical about this last one, because he struck down the one in August, which was, I think, to elementary or regular, I would say, lower schools. This was trying to curtail collegiate and college professors and trying to use the state to dictate what colleges should be taught. And when I read a lot of the opinions from the college professors in the ACLU, they were adamant about they have to teach racism. They have to teach what happened with the Trail of Tears, Manifest Destiny, Homestead Acts, the Fugitive Slave Act, and things like that. So these same folks that want to holler about, you know, free speech and free thought are trying to curtail that. And I think that was I hope his decision reverberates throughout the country, because I believe, Nate, Indiana, they did defeat the anti-CRT bill last spring, but I believe that bill's going to come right back again this spring in this state. And I think we need to be a watch out for that. And what troubles me, and this is for all of you all, that I had a discussion this week about teaching and understanding, because everyone's belly aching about what happened in Virginia with Governor Youngkin, and now they can't teach about Martin Luther King. They can't teach about slavery in Virginia. What happened in South Carolina with that school board vote, and they fired the black superintendent and all those blacks that was on the school board. Now they outlawed teaching about Martin Luther King and everything. But yeah, when I bring up maybe just properly teaching the history of some of these holidays, your black radio cohorts here, they lambasted me. Now we can sit up here and holler about Columbus, and everybody knows that's not true. Matter of fact, they just found footprints in New Mexico in the White Sands Desert, frozen footprints that they're dating 21,000 to 23,000 years old. This is through, they're still trying to figure out. They just found dinosaur bones in Lafayette, 14,000. So we know Columbus wasn't here. So why is it so hard for our people to understand we have got to be the champions of teaching all this truth in the face of the powers that be, or the white establishment, mother, son, daughters of liberty, or whatever, trying to stop it. And I think our people, some of our people just want to go along and get along so bad that they are fearful of doing this. You would be surprised probably. And then why have I not heard any civil rights organizations besides the MSCP or any churches, black churches, coming out standing with our people about against these I call them anti just teaching truth and teaching history bills. It's just very disturbing to me. But I want to champion Walker, and we continue to fight and make sure we tell people in their homes to make sure they teach that. But Nate, what on a local level are you seeing as far as the local school districts making sure that these proper teachings are being done? Because Dr. Payne told me here, we don't have to worry about books being banned in the Indianapolis Public Library system. We have a great library system here. And she assured me there's no banning of any books in our library system. So thanks for taking my call.
Well, here's the problem, Milton and Vanita, on this issue. And I want everybody to know this. This idea of critical race theory is the most ludicrous political stunt I've ever seen. Well, one of the most ludicrous. We are now trying to have people tell us that it's bad to talk about slavery. It's bad to talk about this Jim Crow laws and what happened in America. American history is American history. These things actually occurred. An idea that you can't talk about it, quite frankly, is insulting. And the reason being, we've learned something about history. Person who like knowledge of history is bound to repeat itself. So we have to keep up with historical significance in our country. Otherwise, we can go back to the old days. And when you look at some of the recent Supreme Court decision, and now Milton, Vanita, I was concerned about something. The most recent legislation passed in the Senate, was protection of the right to marriage. So gay marriages is protected now. However, there was no protection given through African America for the right to vote. And I was concerned about that. So we could, and I think that was a big deal. You know, we could pass legislation to protect gay rights, which is a good thing, but we could not get the votes together to protect these draconian measures being taken to adversely impact the Black community from voting. I didn't understand that.
Well, as the gentleman was speaking before you, Nate, I was seeing in my mind the burning of books, the burning of literature back in Nazi Germany, back in the 30s and the start of the 20th century. I was seeing in my mind the vision of not teaching the truth, not teaching racism, not teaching about slavery, not talking and teaching about Martin Luther King and civil rights leaders. It's like, it's the destroying of the truth, of knowledge. And I think the more vivid form of it was done back there with the burning of the books. And now Germany has flipped the script. It probably leads the world in recognizing their wrong, in paying tribute to Jewish people who were put in the ovens and killed, by putting stones or some type of recognition of the homes that they were taken from. They're recognizing the wrongs that they were done, and that history should record those wrongs and deal with them today and recognize them today. That's the only way a people will be able to move forward. So the United States seems to be, Vanita, going backwards in how to handle this social issue. So I think it's an important problem to deal with.
Absolutely, Attorney Grimes and Lee. And first, just a few fundamental points. With respect to critical race theory, let's be clear that critical race theory has never been taught in elementary schools across this nation. This was a false narrative from the very beginning. I don't know what you want to call it, misinformation, disinformation, just false. It was a false premise from the inception. Critical race theory was and is a law school curriculum, part of a law school curriculum that was developed by attorneys Derek Bell and others during the 70s. And I agree with Pierre that we have to come together as a collective community to advocate for truth telling and that our history be taught in our school curriculums. And as Attorney Lee said, if we don't know our history, then we are doomed. Then we are doomed, period. And so I think it's very important that this is a very important and critical issue that we as a collective community of African Americans, as well as communities of color, we should unite around truth telling and the teaching of American history in our school systems.
And it's
Okay,
for
we have,
it's for the benefit of the majority as well as for the minority. It is it's an essential part of our life to know that.
Absolutely, Attorney Grimes. I agree with you wholeheartedly.
yeah, I agree. Okay, Pierre Pullins, what's your comment for today, sir?
Can you hear me, Nate?
Loud and clear.
Yeah. Thank you, Ms. Banks, for giving me credit for raising that legal issue, but that was Imhotep. That was him who raised that issue. And I just wanted to tell you that I wanted you to address, I know you'll get to Trump's friend being convicted of funneling money for the Russian donor. And I know you'll talk about the special prosecutor appointed, but I got 3 attorneys from 3 different jurisdictions. And I wanted to bring up a local incident that happened here this past week where a fella shot and killed somebody that was still in his car. You know, he shot him in the back, Nate, and I guess the guy ran into a tree or something like that. But he had gone in to pay for his gas or something. And then while he was in there paying for his gas, he saw somebody get in his car and take off. He shot at the guy, hit him in the back, and eventually killed him. Now, the prosecutor that just won the race here that you like and love, Nate, has charged the man with murder. So he's sitting in the Marion County jail. Now, the thing is, if that had happened in Hamilton County, he might not have got charged.
Wait a
I
second,
got
Pierre.
3 different attorneys.
Hey,
Yeah.
Pierre, here's the thing. What I discovered by doing thousands of cases is that when you hear reports in the news about crimes and things that occur, almost about 90% of the time, the reporting is inaccurate. So when we start taking
Okay.
deposition and start reviewing video surveillance, we see a different picture. So I can't comment on something like that because I've not seen the source evidence, but I trust that what occurs is that if the person is in commission of a felony, and Milton, Attorney Grimes is much more knowledgeable about this type of stuff, about the use of deadly force, you know, the law allows you to use deadly force in certain situations, and other situations it doesn't. But the case that started this was a famous case called Tennessee versus Garner, where a young man had stolen something and he was fleeing a police officer, he was shot in the back. And that had to do with the fact that that was one of the seminal cases on the use of excessive force, right? And so that case says that a person who's committed that crime, a fleeing suspect, you know, deadly force was not the appropriate sanction, you know, so I don't know what the facts were in that case, but what do you think about that, Attorney Grimes?
Well, here in California, here in LA, there's a sheriff directive that's about 2 years, maybe 3 years old, that they are not to shoot at a fleeing felon in a car, because what you do is create a much bigger dangerous situation in that you are now unleashing the possibility of a bomb, essentially, with that automobile going down the road with no driver in it, and it could run into a group of kids on the sidewalk. It could kill a bunch of people. So it's best to just let that felon escape, even a felon escape, than to put that uncontrolled vehicle on the road for a brief moment that could kill a number of people. So that's the rule for the police. They can't shoot at the fleeing felon. There may be some extenuating circumstances wherein they think that that person is going to take the life of someone immediately, or there's a life in jeopardy immediately, but don't come up with the excuse that we thought he was going to kill someone, blah, 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 blah. It's too dangerous of a situation. So I don't think a citizen should have a greater right to shoot at a person that's fleeing after the commission of a crime, especially in a dangerous vehicle. That's just stupid. You don't have any control of the results of your act. So I think that person, unfortunately, they had been the victim of a theft, not even a robbery, is going to have to face the consequences of that decision of shooting someone, a fleeing person who was not at that time a danger that we can determine. But like Nate said, you don't know all of the facts, but I'm speaking theoretically of that concept. That's all. We don't know all the facts, and the media is in a hurry to get attention and get viewers. And so they go with the most dramatic facts that they can suspect exist, but it's not always the full truth being presented.
Well, yeah, I understand why he's being charged with murder. I understand it, but if I was sitting on a jury, I don't know. I just might go jury nullification on that one and let him go home.
And then what about the two kids that car ran over a block away with the dead driver?
But in this case, it didn't happen. So
I'm not saying what can happen.
All things being considered, I know the prosecutor's legally right for charging him, but I'm tired of this. I'm tired of these crimes. It's just killing us in the community.
But one crime doesn't justify another crime. Hey man, I'm not holding that I feel one way or another. I'm just explaining to you what the law is that I'm familiar with and the reason for it.
Yeah, I got you. I understand.
That occurs. Hey Pierre, here's a real problem that occurs when a citizen decides to become a law enforcement official. There's a certain amount of risk every time that you fire a gun, right? I see people that are dumb enough, for example, to shoot up in the air to celebrate, not realizing that if you shoot a gun up in the air, the bullet eventually got to come down. So there's been circumstances. I remember one time somebody shot a gun up in the air and then ended up shooting a guy on the golf course, half mile away. So every time you do that, there's a certain amount of risk involved with harming an innocent third person. And so if the government takes a position that we want citizens to have the right, like for example, there was a case, as you remember, a really bad situation down in Greenwood where a guy was in a mall and started shooting, and then another citizen shot and killed him.
Right.
You remember that, Pierre?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so they were saying this guy was a hero for killing the assailant, right? And so in that case, he killed somebody who's killing somebody else in the commission of a felony where he's killing people.
Right, and that's an exceptional circumstance that I'm talking about.
You see the difference? So if you got somebody who's about to kill somebody, then you got a proportionate response, death versus death. But if you got a property damage, and so if your car is stolen, if you fall into the law, you're required to have car insurance. So if you have car insurance, your maximum out of pocket is a deductible between $100 to $500 deductible. And so, in other words, you don't really have the type of damages you will have versus human life. And that's the thought process. There's never a right decision about this, but just a thought process. We value human life more than we value property. We
But
still do.
In that,
Just before I
in that mall, Pierre, in that mall shooting, there was a reasonable, foreseeable chance that that man would kill the woman that he was holding hostage. And as I understand, he was on a killing spree. Maybe I'm wrong about the memory of those facts, but that was a different situation justifying his act.
Yeah, the reason I brought it up, Nate, is because a couple years ago we had a young Marine almost essentially do the same thing. He shot and killed somebody that was still in his car, and he got tried, and he went to he went to that jury trial, and I believe they acquitted him. I don't know if the circumstances were different, but I know his car was being stolen. The young guy shot the whoever was still in his car. They took him to trial on a murder charge, and that kid walked. So, and that happened here a couple years ago. So I was hoping that you might have remembered that case, Nate, but I don't know. But thanks, guys. I appreciate it. I just wanted your perspective. And, in this case, if I'm sitting on the jury, he's walking. And I know that may not legally be right, but.
Well, you probably shouldn't say that publicly because you'll probably get excused from the jury for saying that. So keep your thought process to yourself about public service. Don't forget that. Now,
there's an important, let me address that, what he just said briefly. There's an important aspect of what you just said, sir, and that is that, it's come back to my days of doing death penalty cases. Black people have a tendency of sitting there saying, this is what I will do. I don't believe police officers. I think they're lying when they come in here, and my cousin was mistreated by the police, and I can't be fair to the prosecution because I know the police lie. You don't know that you're not going to be fair. Can't you sit there and do like other potential jurors do? And that is say, I can consider the evidence. And you truly can. And I can consider whether the evidence proved this or proved that. Yes, I have feelings a certain way, but I will not say I cannot look at the evidence and judge it fairly. Thank you, potential Black juror, because we need you to sit in this case to assure that there's fairness to people of your color. Do you get my point, Pierre?
Yeah, I hope so, because I've been doing a personal injury jury trial, and I went for 3 years, Attorney Grimes and Banks. I had no African American on my jury here locally, and then I get a Black male on the jury, and I got a personal injury case involving substantial damages. And he says, well, I can't sit on the jury. Why? Because I don't believe in the death penalty. I'm thinking, now we've told this idiot, and I call him an idiot, that this is a civil case involving damages. So because of the wrongful death case, he thought, I don't know what the hell he was thinking, but he did everything possible not to sit on the jury.
All right.
And I did everything possible to try to keep him on the jury. Now, we won the case, but it was just the challenges that I see. And so I want people to know that it's important that you serve on jury service. It's important. I mean, I did a recent trial last month, and we had 2 African-American on my jury. I think, thank God, I not seen that. And the result, we got a 7-figure verdict. Now, I thought that was important because it takes race out of the equation.
And it's I love my people, but it seems as though, I'm sorry, but seem as though we have a more impulse to be truthful and to tell it. And that's not being not truthful if you say you can consider the evidence. You can set aside your prejudgment of things and look at things fairly and objectively. You can do that. But we tend to get on that jury and think, oh, I got to tell them I can't be fair because at this moment I'm against that. That ain't the question. The question is, can you be fair if you sit here as a juror? Can you set aside your preconceived notions and ideas and feelings about things and be fair? And you honestly can do that. People can do that.
Absolutely.
And it's important that Blacks be on juries, y'all.
Absolutely. Diversity matters on juries. It absolutely does matter. And I've heard trial lawyers like Attorney Lee and Grimes state that if there's one African-American juror on the jury, that levels the playing field substantially.
It can make
one. And so it's very critical. In addition to our obligation as a citizen to vote in each and every election up and down the ballot, the second, and I would say equally most important obligation of a citizen, an American citizen, is to serve on a jury. If you are called, please serve for all the reasons that we're discussing this morning.
I only refer to it briefly, Nate. If it hadn't been for minority jurors, and in particular this Filipino juror who turned out to be the foreperson in the Rodney King civil rights case, we would not have won that case because the three white men said he shouldn't get a penny. He started that fight. He caused the police to beat him the way they beat him with that baton. And the three white women said, well, whatever y'all decide is fair. And the two Latino women said, well, no, we got to do something about this because this is an injustice that takes place in the barrio too. And the Black woman said, y'all might as well bring a big lunch. This is told to me by the foreperson because we're going to be a long time because this young man is going to get some justice. And the Filipino juror who surprised me and I thought tricked me into sitting on this jury came out being the foreperson. And I talked to her afterwards and I told her how she scared the hell out of me for 6 weeks. And she said, no, I knew I had to take a position of conservative appearance to the court and to my fellow jurors, and I did that. And that's why they nominated me the foreperson. And I was determined that I was going to get justice for this young man because I have 2 Black sons, because she was the widow of the co-founder of the Black Panther Party here in LA. And that didn't come out. Nate, that didn't come out in the trial. The judge asked the question, he void-eyed. I said, now, if I had void-eyed, I would ask that one question that would have revealed that position of hers, that she was a widow of the co-founder of the Black Panther Party here in LA. And if it hadn't been for her steering that ship into the harbor, the best we would have gotten was a hung jury. But she directed it, Vanita, towards a quotient verdict, divided the monetary counts of each one, zeros of the 3 white men and whatever figure of the 3 white women and the millions of the minorities, and divided it by 10 and said it was $3,816,535.42. I said, where'd you get the 42 cents from? She said, that was to make y'all think we worked hard. That's a true story, y'all. I'm sorry I had to tell it.
That's a fascinating story. But Renee Shaw is really making some excellent point. One of our listeners, she wanted us to think that we should have a class on civic duty, which help educate the public on what it means to be a juror and what it means to be a voter, etc. Well, I don't want to change the subject from the jury, but we're gonna run out of time. I do want to talk real quickly also about voting. for our listeners down in Georgia, they have a guy who's a football hero named Walker, first name Herschel, running for U.S. Senate. I personally know Herschel Walker when I was a law student, a second-year law student. Herschel Walker was an incoming freshman at the University of Georgia. We would play basketball every day over the summer in Stegman Gym. We had some phenomenal athlete. One of the greatest athletes I ever met was a guy named Dominique Wilkins. So we played every day, Dominique, Tree Rollins, a lot of professional athletes would come over and we played basketball every afternoon. And then every now and then, Herschel Walker would show up. And I got to talk to him and his sister Veronica. And Herschel was a terrible basketball player, so he couldn't run with these guys. But Herschel was probably one of the dumbest athletes I ever met, way back then.
And let me advise you. Go ahead.
And so when they ran him right tackle, left tackle, I was thinking that he probably was not smart enough to remember all the plays. And that was my impression of my honest opinion of what I thought about him at the time. You know what? It hasn't changed. He's got a bigger stage now, but he hasn't changed. And so when people down there in Georgia, it's embarrassing to think that someone who is so ill-equipped to hold public office could get that many votes. It's unsettling to me, quite frankly, Milton, Vanita. It just is.
Damn.
Attorney Lee, this is a very important and critical Senate runoff election scheduled for December 6th. And it's important that all of our listeners, even those outside of the state of Georgia, support this runoff election and support the election protection efforts. I would ask that all listeners, and share this with your friends, and I'll put the information in the chat box. Please go to votingrightsalliance.org to sign up to support the runoff election. First, of course, you can send money to Georgia to support the campaign there. You can also sign up to send text and make phone calls to Georgia voters, encouraging them to vote in the runoff election. You can go to Georgia and monitor polls. And on election day, you can answer questions and address concerns. There will be a voting rights command center. We want to ensure that we continue to guard against voter suppression. It was reported in the midterm election that 167,000 voters ballots were challenged in Georgia, and that one person challenged 31,000 voters. So we still have work to do in Georgia, and I encourage you to sign up at votingrightsalliance.org.
Well, thank you very much. And I'd like to remind our audience that this week is coming up is Thanksgiving. And so next Saturday we'll be off in observance of the Thanksgiving holiday. And we like to thank all our listening audience for joining us today in this important discussion. And I want everybody remember that safe travel over the holiday time period. There's going to be a record number of people on the highways and roadways. And in 2 weeks, we'll come back, we'll finish this discussion about the jury service, because I think we have a nerve here that we've opened up that we have to deal with. We'll start talking about educating people about serving on jury duties and things like that. Until then, God bless and keep you, and thank our special guests today and our callers come in today. And happy Thanksgiving to everyone. Stay safe, and God bless you all.
That was a hell of an indictment on Mr. Walker, Mr. Lee. Jesus Christ. That's a bologna sandwich